first thing I want to say is that I don't know how to describe how great I feel being invited to come, because it's one of the greatest honors that I have ever had in teaching. I taught for 36 years, 16 of them here at York College, and I received a number of honors, but not anything like this. 2 years ago, after we got through with our sessions, Steve came to me and he said, this was a little later, maybe at supper time or sometime. He said, would you do this again 2 years from now? And I said, Steve, I'll be 83. And he said, so? So we're going to find out, so. Because in the meantime, many things have happened. The worst thing that happened was last July, I had a mini stroke. I had just started getting these indications of sciatica. And I had that mini stroke, and then it really hit me. So I hate to sit down while teaching, but I'll probably do that most of the time today and tomorrow. And if I last that long, Wednesday, Friday, and so forth. There's going to be a script handed out for everybody at the end. Obviously, there's a good reason for not having it at the beginning. We can just all go home. There'll be a script, and it will not contain all the ad-libs, because ad-libs come as you think about them. And I'm sure there'll be plenty. I think about all kinds of things when I think about the 1960s. Mostly I think about York College, because that's where I was during the 1960s. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint. The first time I used one was 2 years ago when I was here. And I've learned a lot about it since then. But something happened, and I'm not going into detail, but something happened and somebody destroyed some of the stuff on my computer and got to part of the PowerPoint. And when I discovered it a couple of weeks ago, I said to myself, I'll just leave it like it is. And they're all understanding people. If they don't understand, well, who cares? I don't feel like anyway, you understand. And every once in a while, even though it may be difficult, I want you to smile. Because somebody's going to take a picture every once in a while. The publisher of our newspaper told me that she wanted me to take notes of what's going on this week. And she wanted to write an article about RoundUp this week. 2 years ago, the editor of the paper decided to write an article. Only he put it in a magazine that is printed once a month there. And so in this Lake Living magazine of June of 2014, there's a deal that has something to do with RoundUp, but he spent more time on my making of quilts during that time. I didn't have any desire to look at this thing. It's 2 years old, so it's outdated and all that. But I think he did RoundUp a good job, and then he did me a lot more favors than that. I did a lot of reading besides what I already knew and so forth about the 1960s. And I came across a statement that I want you to listen to, because this will explain why I'm going to have some difficulties from time to time. It was written by John Stevens in a section called The Counterculture in a publication called The Social Fabric. There is no simple way to explain what went on in the 60s. Now this is, well, sometimes the 1960s is called the decadent decade. Sometimes it's called the decade that changed the world. Sometimes it's called the world on the brink. And those of you who live, let's see. Those of us, all of us lived through it in the 1960s. And we know that we can call it a lot of other things. But the decadent decade was also given to the 1920s. And some of you may remember that. I doubt that many of you would. The 1980s, the 1990s, maybe even others. But it was given to the 1980s primarily because because of Motley Crue. I already did something I wasn't supposed to do, and I can't remember what goes backwards. Previous. Go back. There you go. This is different from what I am accustomed to. Almost everything is different. I'd like to know how many are here who ever had a class under me, a history class under me, or any kind of class at York College under me. I'm going to get this number because that publisher wanted to know something. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Is there a test?
I guess we have 12. That's. I'm sorry. That's all I can say. If you have to put up with me again, but don't worry, it won't be long. Motley Crue had this thing, the album by the title of Motley Crue, or by the decade of decades. I told somebody that I was going to get mixed up a lot. Just count it to age. I'm getting older every day. So we're going to simply call it the 1960s, or a decade of change. There were lots of changes that took place during that time. It was a time of assassinations. Some of you remember that. It was awful, actually. There were 6 in the United States, and there were many throughout the world. Many throughout the world. In some cases, it's hard to know the difference between a murder and an assassination. Isn't that right? So-and-so was murdered. No, he was assassinated. He's still dead. But the main difference is that an assassination is usually for impersonal reasons, and murder involves emotions. But take a look at these. These are all called assassinations, and yet it seems to me, looking back on it, that there was an awful lot of emotion involved in the reason behind these assassinations. So I don't know how good definitions are, but anyway, we have June 12th, 1963. Medgar Evers, a civil rights leader, was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi. We'll come back to him later. November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. I was talking to Dick a little bit earlier, sometime this week anyway. Time runs together. When was it? Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. And I asked Dick if he remembered that time. He was in a class with me at that time. And we, of course, decided to dismiss class. And there was a student who made a very insulting remark as he was walking out. He said it so that I could hear it concerning President Kennedy. And I remember the look that Dick gave to that student. Nobody appreciates an insult given to anybody, no matter what you think about him after he's been assassinated. But anyway, February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X, black Muslim leader. He was assassinated in New York City by black Muslim members. August 25th, 1967, George Lincoln Rockwell in Arlington, Virginia. He was the leader of the American Nazi Party. Do you see a trend here? Leaders are being assassinated. On April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee. Before we leave him, and we'll come back to him later, I taught world history for years after I left York College. Taught world history, and naturally we would come to a certain time to Martin Luther. Taught at a school that from the time I started there until I left, the percentage of black students rose from 60% to 70%. And I remember when I was one year talking about Martin Luther, and one student raised his hand and said, "It's Martin Luther King Jr." I said, "No, I'm talking about Martin Luther." "No, it's Martin Luther King Jr." I don't think I ever convinced him that there was a man by the name of Martin Luther. But in this particular case, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. June 5th, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy in Los Angeles, California, after he won the California primary. So there seems to be quite a trend in the United States concerning the assassinations. It was a decade of crime increase. Violent crimes almost doubled during the 1960s. And the rate has not yet gone back to the rate that it was in the beginning of the 1960s. Some politicians campaigned very strongly on the idea of law and order. Richard Nixon was one of them. Then, of course, we remember George Wallace. He pronounced it a little different. Law and order is the way he usually said it. Some of you might remember that. I'm going to say a few personal things because, well, that's the only kind of experiences I've ever had. Because during the 1960s, I was right here, not in this building. I was right here at York College. Some of the best years of my life. And May 1961, I received my master's degree from Harding College. Came to York to teach at McCool Junction. Some of you know where that is. You came up 81, you passed right. You may not have noticed it, but you passed right. McCool Junction. During the summer, I worked in Georgia as an electrician with my brothers-in-law. We came to York in August, and I renovated the house on Mayhew Street. When you get your manuscript, you'll see that this statement is made. It was approximately where the York College sign is. But when I saw this picture, didn't show me exactly where that sign is, because it looks like it's where that house was. But if you'll notice in the picture, the signs back there in the parking area, where, and you can't see it, but where it says handicap parking, that's approximately where the house was. That's the house on Mayhew Street. We lived there for 1 year. Dale Larson, we renovated the house, which meant, well, the plaster was falling and all this, and we took this off and we put sheetrock up and this kind of thing. I think Gail Napier helped me, but I don't remember exactly. There was somebody who helped me during that time. What?
Paul touched.
Paul, that was when Paul, that was right after Paul went. Paul helped me on the Kodak building. Yeah. Well, since she mentioned that, I'm going to Paul had never done any sheetrock work before. And so he was the muscle, and I was the, well, anyway, I made decisions. And we would put up some sheetrock, and he'd say, well, we have a problem here. And I'd say, don't worry about it, the table covering. And so all through, and I said that many times, all through the school year, when we got together talking about problems at York College, there weren't many, but talking about different problems that existed with students, one or the other of us would say, table covering. And so we had a lot of fun. But anyway, Dale Larson, most of you know him, president of York College at the time, came down here to just see what was going on. Jeanette had a shovel, and she was shoveling out the debris from the house. And he said, I have it quoted right here. I've heard of people having to shovel the mess out of their house, but this is the first time I've ever seen it. You know the implication is, the following summer, we were paid on a 9-month basis, even at McCool Junction. Following summer, I had worked on campus, primarily cleaning bathrooms to begin with, and then doing some other work on repairs and so forth in the dorms. And some of the teachers here complained that I was having to do that work. I wanted to do that work because I needed the money. And so anyway, they thought, a college teacher ought not to have to do that kind of work. At that time, I was part-time college, and that I want to mention that a bit. September 1961, I taught my first history class ever. It was at York College, because it started before McCool Junction. And I don't know why, but Gail Napier convinced Dr. Larson that, and Neighbor Miller, of course he was the dean, that I ought to teach a class. Gail didn't want to teach European history. And I was the fall guy. So anyway, he convinced them, and I had a night class. And this night class, well, it was the first history class that I taught. I'd just gotten my master's degree from Harding. And I got to that class. And by the way, the student body was 82 at that time. Big college. 82. I got to that class and, I looked at the roll sheet ahead of time. 62 people in that class. At the break, 2 of them dropped out. And I think shortly after that, after the rest of it, one other dropped out. But I had a pretty large class. I think I had 59 all the rest of the night. But anyway, that was a very enjoyable thing. First class of history at York College. Well, I'll be teaching my last history class at York College sometime this week. I don't know when. It may be today, it may be Friday. One never knows. If you ever reach my age, excuse me for saying this, if you ever reach my age, you'll know that you can't count on tomorrow. It may not come. So anyway, that's why I say that. But I've thoroughly enjoyed teaching history. The end comes to everything that's good. It comes to everything, good and bad, eventually. I want to tell you about my first chapel speak. Why am I talking about me?
No.
It reminds me of our youngest son. We can talk about different things, and pretty soon he'll say, okay, now back to me. So the reason I am is that I was at York College almost all the 1960s. We're talking about the 1960s. We want to get the important stuff taken care of first, and then we can get on with the history part of it. But the other history. My first chapel talk at York College was pretty close to where we are right now. This is where the old gym was, isn't it? You remember the old gym? The one that almost fell down? Chapel was in the gym at that time. Excuse me. I was teaching at Muku Junction, but they had a holiday when York College didn't. So naturally, Gail Napier wanted to get out of something. And how many of you know Gail? He and Grace really wanted to be here, but he's having some problems, and you'll understand that when you get to certain age. But anyway, I was asked to make a chapel talk. I decided to do my best, and I decided to speak on the subject, the first two lines of Rudyard Kipling's If. We all know that, don't we? If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. That's as far as I went. That's all I knew of it then. That's all I know of it now. But if you can keep your head. I talked about the beheading of Mary, Queen of Scots. You remember her? Before your time. Mary, Queen of Scots, left Scotland and went to England during the time of Elizabeth I. It was always rumored that she was trying to take the throne of England, which of course would be treason. Elizabeth I did not like that idea and didn't believe it. But eventually somebody convinced her that Mary was trying to take the throne. And so Elizabeth had her condemned as a traitor. And of course you know what happens to traitors. One of the things that most people did not know was that Mary had almost no hair. And so she wore a wig all the time. The custom of the time was when a traitor was beheaded, the executioner would pick up the head by the hair and hold it up and say, "Long live the king or queen," whichever it happened to be. Chop, thud, long live the oops. There went the head rolling across it. I'm not going into any more detail than that. I talked about the beheading of Charles I of England. You remember Oliver Cromwell led a revolution and defeated Charles' troops. And Charles was a traitor, even though he was a king. And that was the period of the interregnum. Some of you know about that. But anyway, I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed chapel toward the end, and I'm going to come back to one of those to illustrate something later. But toward the end, I had, excuse me, I had a lot of chapel talks titled, "What in the World is Going On?" You know, that would be current events. On April 5th, 1966, we had a son, Jonathan, born in New York General Hospital. How many of you know Jimmy Allen? Good, good, and you'll appreciate this. When I get excited, this happens to my throat, and I may not look excited, but I am. For some reason, Jimmy came to I'm going to back up a bit first. Way back in 1953, when Jeanette and I got married, Jimmy thought he was best man in our wedding. I got Jeanette, so you know who the best man was. But so we had a close relationship for years. So not long after Jonathan was born, Jimmy came to York to speak. I'm not sure if it was a college thing or a church thing, but we met at the city auditorium. You know where we had a lot of basketball games. And this thing was full, and here I was sitting there holding Jonathan, and Jeanette was sitting beside me. And he insults me right there in front of everybody. And this old man up there has just had a baby. But anyway, this old man is a new daddy, and I was 33. I had gray hair, well, partly gray hair. But very closely related to this, and you'll probably understand why. One week after Jonathan was born, the Braves had their first game in Atlanta. Well, when Jeanette and I went to Wisconsin, we saw the Braves play, Milwaukee Braves play, and that was our first Major League Baseball game to attend. Our last Major League Baseball game to attend was the Atlanta Braves in Atlanta, Georgia. Thought that might be interesting to you, maybe not. But I've been a Braves fan no matter what happens, and you know what's happening right now. I don't know what happened last night or the night before that, but I'm still a Braves fan, always will be. In 1966 also, there was a Uniform Time Act. It established daylight saving time. There have been a lot of complaints about it since. A lot of people like it. I don't know why we don't just leave time as it is. If we want to get up earlier, let's get up earlier. If we want to go to bed earlier, go to bed earlier. I've gone to bed many times when the sun's shining. I don't mind. I've gotten up many times when it was black outside for 5 or 6, 7 hours. But anyway, daylight saving time, that's 1966. In June 1968, I started a 2-year leave of absence from York College to get a doctor's degree at Mississippi State University. From September 1969 to May of 1970, I taught 2 semesters of history at Mississippi State. I was told that they were business students. They had to take 1 semester of history, and it didn't matter what I taught. Can you imagine? I stood before a group of probably 60, 70 students, 2 different semesters, but I said, okay, this class is from Adam to Nixon. What do you want to study? The 1960s. What? This was 1969, the first time, but I had just left York College, and in every class, toward the end of the semester, the students would ask questions. Would you explain some things that's happened in the 1960s? Would you this and would you that about the night? So I just took time out and spent a couple of days talking about the changes in the 1960s. The next semester, I said, Adam to Nixon, what do you want to study? The 1960s. Okay, good. I was just taught the previous. They all, both semesters, they requested exactly the same things, including Greek history, something about Roman history. They requested even the Renaissance of all things. So I had a lot of fun teaching at Mississippi State because it was stuff that they wanted to listen to. Now the real stuff. I wanted to introduce a lot of stuff because it does have a specific relationship to me and also to York College, to what we're doing right now. The United States had 4 presidents in the 1960s. Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard M. Nixon. Each one was unique. Eisenhower was the oldest. Kennedy was the youngest when he was elected. Johnson was had the most political experience and political know-how. Oh, excuse me, I'm not supposed to shake my head. That tells me what I think. And Nixon was the first and only one so far to resign from the office. Each one different in many, many other ways also. Eisenhower was a general in World War II. He was elected in November 1952 and re-elected in November 1956. One of the main campaign slogans he had was that they had at the time was "I like Ike." Now, Thursday we're going to have the opportunity of going to his library and museum. We had the opportunity a few years ago to go to his birthplace in Texas. They gave us some little pins that said, "I like Ike," but there was a little difference. It had a little arrow there, and right up above it said, "Still." I still like Ike. Jeanette said earlier, I should have brought my "I still like Ike" thing with me, but we didn't think of it at the time. I like Ike. And almost everybody did. He was a very popular president. had no political experience at all. His major political belief was that there's too much government. He left, well, let's look at this first. I think that people want peace so much that one of these days government had better get out of their way and let them have it. But anyway, he left lawmaking to Congress. Of all things. That's what they're supposed to do. Presidents are not lawmakers. They can suggest. By the way, we hear the Constitution mentioned once in a while. The intent of the writers of the Constitution was to have the president, whenever he wanted to call Congress together and make a State of the Union message and suggest things that he might think of. Because he's not sitting with Congress. They're making the laws. They're discussing these things. And he said, that's what the president is supposed to do. He knew what the Constitution said, apparently, better than Congress did, and better than previous presidents did, and I better not get on that soapbox for very long because I'll have more and more to say about that, but that's probably enough. He left lawmaking to Congress, and Truman had lost the dignity of the presidential office. Just what you know about the two men, just think about it. The John Birch Society labeled him as a communist. You remember that? Any of it? Remember that? The founder of the John Birch Society, Robert Welch, wrote a book titled The Politician. That was supposed to be Eisenhower. And he called him a conscious, dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy, accused him of deliberate treason. They gave reasons. When we talk about reasons for doing things, usually they're made up. But one of the reasons was allowing the USSR to take Berlin after at the end of World War II. You know the Soviet Union did, and you know all the problems that led to in connection with Berlin and Germany and so forth. But in a summit conference before that time, that decision was already made. It wasn't something that Eisenhower could do anything about. Top general in Europe, but he couldn't do anything about it. Because the president, the prime minister, and so forth made that decision before they ever got there. The Cold War was heating up in 1960. But many believe that the spirit of Geneva could be revived with another good summit meeting. Nikita Khrushchev made many threats, and he said, we're going to unite Berlin by cutting off all the Western communication. You know, there was one main highway from Western Germany into Berlin, into Western Berlin. So we're going to cut off all these routes, other ones also, and then we'll allow East Germany to take over the control of Berlin. You know what allowing East Germany to do anything was. The rest of the world was so concerned about nuclear testing and contamination of the atmosphere and so forth. All of this was just happening so fast. And most of the world seemed to think that a summit conference was necessary. So after a lot of discussion, the USSR, the United States, France, Great Britain agreed to a meeting on May the 16th, 1960. But you remember May Day, the importance of May Day in the USSR. They had a good time. On May the 1st, the U.S. spy plane, the U-2, was shot down inside of the USSR. The U-2 was a reconnaissance plane. Reconnaissance is a long word that means spy. Actually, it means to gather information. That's what spying is anyway. But to gather information, and part of what they were gathering was information concerning the weather. So it was called a weather plane by many people. The Soviets only announced that a U.S. airplane had been down in their territory, and they canceled the summit meeting. A very unwise U.S. statement said that the weather plane had accidentally strayed across the border. Lincoln White, working with the U.S. State Department, said, there has been no deliberate attempt to violate Soviet airspace. Khrushchev responded with all the facts. The United States lied. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was alive. He confessed to being a spy. The United States had assumed that Powers had been killed in the crash. And if he had not been killed, he had a little pill with him that he was supposed to take if he was captured. Now, if I had that little pill and I was captured, I'd sort of come in, get rid of it. And I don't know what he did with it, but he definitely didn't take it. Cameras on the U-2 planes were almost unbelievable. I'm going to do some reading every once in a while. I have a very short bibliography, that's not what I call it, at the end of the printout that you're going to get at the end. William Manchester made this statement. Photo interpreters studying huge enlargements could actually read a newspaper headline that had been 9 or 10 miles below the aircraft. Let that soak in. From 9 or 10 miles up, a camera could take a picture of a newspaper and actually, you could read that. The cameras on Powers U-2 aircraft contained photos of military installations in the USSR more than 1,000 miles. But instead of blaming other people, President Eisenhower accepted full responsibility. He said that spy missions were distasteful but vital. I get carried away with what I'm thinking about and forget about that thing. I'm not good at PowerPoints, but that's all right. One of the favorite pictures that we have of Khrushchev all the time is either raising his fist, talking, or with his shoe beating on the podium. He demanded an apology. Eisenhower became angry. By the way, that was a very unusual thing. Eisenhower almost never became angry. I guess he learned that he shouldn't in his time as a general. But he became angry. He controlled himself well, though. But he refused to apologize. But he did say the U-2 flights will stop. And so I'm going to stop here. We're supposed to stop at 11 anyway, aren't we? You know how students are. How in the world did they shoot down a U-2 plane in the first place? Some facts. It could fly at 90,000 feet. But it could stall, it's called a flame out, at 70,000 feet. So you know they're not going to be flying up there at 90,000 feet all the time. When it had a flame out, it had to drop to about 40,000 feet in order to restart. That was, at the time, the approximate altitude that the Soviet rockets were affecting. Now that was a story we heard at the time. And I believe that. They didn't give us all the information. Let's see, the rest of the story, right? Another story which was affirmed by Powers was that his was a defective U-2 plane, that they'd had many problems with it the weeks before he flew it. Both Powers and Khrushchev said that the plane was shot down at 65,000 feet, which is quite a bit higher than our official report was. And we realized that Powers was not a spy in the real sense. He was a button pusher. You get to a certain place, you push the button. That activates the cameras. You get to another place, you push a button, the cameras go off. You fly the plane, and it flew itself most of the time, except when it was backing up. If he had been trained as a spy, he would have kept his mouth shut. So there would not have been all that information given out if he'd really been a spy. He was a pilot, and a good one. Later on, Khrushchev said that there had always been spying and would always be spying. They had known of the U-2 flights ever since the beginning, but they were not able to shoot one down until this one. Powers and a student were later exchanged for Rudolph Abel. That's a name that some of you probably remember. He was a Soviet spy that they didn't know. All through the negotiations, they were saying, we don't know any Rudolph Abel, and then they would negotiate for his return. There's no him.
Sure wanted to come home.
Since Eisenhower spent nearly all of his entire life, adult life at least, in the military, and as president, he knew very little about what was going on with everything. I know little about this thing. Back to me. I use a PowerPoint every once in a while when preaching. I try to do it about once a month on Sunday night. And I really enjoy it, and most of the people enjoy it, but Sherry announced to a lot of people in the congregation that they were dragging me into the 21st century, kicking and screaming. Kicking and screaming. Well, I'm still kicking and screaming. Can't scream very loud. Eisenhower knew very little about what was going on in everyday life. He didn't know how to enter an automatic toll lane in a highway. Anybody ought to know. He had never adjusted a TV set. Somebody always did it for him. He couldn't place a telephone call. After leaving the presidency, he tried to call his son John. He thought he could just lift up the phone and tell the operator what he wanted. He lifted up the phone, and all he could hear was a buzzing sound. And he'd punch and punch and punch, and it would buzz. So he tried and finally gave up and asked a Secret Service agent to help. Eisenhower has not had high ratings from historians. That's understandable when you understand the fact that most well-known historians are well, you know. But I think it's because he only wanted to do the job of a president. While he was president, all he wanted to be was president. You know that, don't you? Other presidents want to be the judge. They want to be the Supreme Court. They want to be the Congress and so forth. You know some of those. But when he left office, he had the highest approval rating of any president after an 8-year period. And I don't think any president has beat him. And in my opinion, he's still up there. He's still popular by most people. Oh, not long before he died, do you remember what his favorite pastime was? Golf. On March the 28th, 1968, he finally made a hole-in-one. Not long before he died. And he called it the thrill of a lifetime. Mamie outlived him for 11 and a half years. I almost say 100. As early as July of 1959, John F. Kennedy was talking about running for president in November 1960. I'm going to quote from Schlesinger quite a bit, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Some of you know that name, don't you? He seems fairly optimistic about his presidential chances. He thinks that Humphrey can't win, that Johnson will take care of Symington, and that he will go into Los Angeles with a large delegate lead. The feeling between Kennedy and Johnson was awful. That's my words. Adlai Stevenson was quoted as saying, obviously the feeling between the two of them is savage. John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson. Keep those two names in mind. After Kennedy's nomination, there was a lot of speculation about the vice presidential candidate. Schlesinger wrote, everyone dismisses Johnson, and I really like this comment. Everyone dismisses Johnson as impossible. It may have to be offered to him, they say, but he wouldn't accept it. And then in parentheses he put, I have an uneasy feeling he might. Schlesinger knew about the power-hungry feeling that Johnson had, and I have a feeling that's what he was thinking about. The day after it was hinted that Johnson might be offered the possibility to run for vice president, and I say that because they didn't know if he would accept it. There was a lot of vacillating between on his part and on Kennedy's part. Kennedy unofficially asking him, and Johnson whether or not he would accept if it were asked him. There was a lot of opposition from Robert Kennedy. When he finally heard that John Kennedy had selected Johnson, Robert Kennedy slammed the receiver down on the telephone, according to Schlesinger. But Schlesinger thought that Johnson was a good choice politically because it would keep Johnson from opposing Kennedy from the Senate. And Johnson had an awful lot of power in the Senate. We'll mention some of that later when we get to Johnson. JFK was the youngest president when elected, November 1960, at age 43. Theodore Roosevelt was 42 years old when he became president after William McKinley's assassination in 1901. So they were very close in age, but Kennedy was the youngest to be elected. Kennedy was also the wealthiest to be elected. At age 21, his father gave him $1 million to encourage him to enter politics. When you were 21, were you offered that? When Jackie Kennedy learned that he was donating his $100,000 a year salary to charity, just like Herbert Hoover had done. Herbert Hoover didn't accept, most of you probably know this, but didn't accept one penny for all the work he did, not just as president, but he was on commission after commission before and after his presidency, and he even paid all of his expenses. That's Herbert Hoover. But Kennedy donated his $100,000 a year salary to charity. But the reason Jackie was upset about it was that she wanted to use it in a new house that she was having built in Virginia. She was constantly telling people that they didn't have near the money that people thought they had. People might have thought that they were worth $100 million and they were only worth $98 million. But that's just figures. She continued to be a big spender. One example, in 1962 she spent, $121,000 for clothing. That was 1962. Can you remember your salary in 1962? I can remember mine, approximately. It was in the $5,000 range. Most teachers at York that year were making somewhere around $6,000. I was working for McCool Junction. So I can remember that. 120, well. But Kennedy was known for being thrifty in White House affairs. For example, He used New York champagne instead of French champagne, which was the custom before his time. Kennedy served from January 1961 until, that's up there too soon, but we'll get to it, until November 22nd, 1963. During his campaign, he stressed his youth and vigor.